Okay, now as always, please feel free to answer questions, to ask questions throughout. Just interrupt me or pop something in the chat. I may not see the chat straight away. I'll try to keep it up there, but I'll get to your questions if I miss it straight off. So today we're going to be talking about mastering your methodology, and its session is really more about looking at the type of structures that people use in their methodology chapters, not going to be taking people through much about the language of how to write, how to open your paragraphs in methodology, what the best type of language structures are to use that. I'm totally happy to cover that another time, but we just don't have time for this. And I have so many really cool examples of methodology chapters I want to show you. And I do have one that has a little bit of an intro in there. You can have a look at that. So today I'll be talking about what methodology is, reminding you where to find some examples of methodologies. So in other words, mainly thesis. You don't really get a lot of discussion around methodology in journal articles, some in, for instance, health sciences and the more empirical studies that are based on observation or quite specific participant data collection. They may have, as a journal article, may have methodology sections or a discussion on methodology, but many other journal articles don't. So often, given that you're doing a thesis of some sort, the best way to check out what methodology sections look like is to actually go to a thesis. So I've got some examples of the places you can go to find those, and I'll also talk you through some examples of sections in methodology. And what I'm trying to do is to kind of cover a different section of the thesis every week in this term's training with some guests along the way. Okay. So what is a methodology? Thinking about the most common word that comes up when we talk about methodology is how. How are you going to go about your research? What are the steps that you're going to take to answer your research question? And it does all come back to the research question. So thinking about what sort of steps need to be taken in order to give you the most, the most thorough answer to the research question that you can offer, given you may only have access to a certain amount of people or a certain amount of population or a particular text or areas. So sometimes the way we want to answer a research question is much more ambitious than what we're actually able to, because we don't have access to the data or the participants or the environments that we need to really dig into, find the answer to what we are asking. So we do kind of have to make, I suppose, some sensible decisions when we think about methodology as to what is the best way to answer this question given what I have access to. And we saw this in COVID when we had to switch to interviewing from in-person to Zoom, etc., or possibly change our participants in order to have a safer form of access. So methodology is a lot about the how. So how can the inquirer go about finding out whatever he or she believes can be known about? So again, thinking about you know, how you can get in there and find what it is you need to discover. What are the steps you take? So it's about thinking about also the theoretical and philosophical assumptions that you may be bringing to your research. So are you coming into the research with a set point of view already, with a set idea of what you want to find, and how might that influence your findings or the way you conduct this study? And inevitably we do bring our own biases to things, and we kind of come to the research with the ideas that we have seen acted out, or the problems or the solutions that we've seen acted out in some way often. So it's a lot about coming up front and trying to work out what those assumptions or values are that you're coming into the research with. And most of the time we are investigating something because we have some personal engagement with it, or we've been affected by it in some way, or we've seen someone go through this challenge, and we want to make a contribution to make sure that the next person that goes through this down the track, or a couple of years down the track, has a different experience, or there's a framework we can offer to guide policy, or to guide manufacture or creative process around something. So we kind of are always coming into our research with some positioning. So we need, as part of the methodology, we're often asked to think about what assumptions we're bringing in, and any of the implications that we may be creating for the methods, or the methods that we're adopting. So if I choose a particular tool to do something, like if I'm using interviews, open-ended interviews, that's going to give me a particular type of outcome. That's going to privilege a set of information over what I might get if I'm just doing surveys. So as a researcher, if I'm doing open-ended discussions with, or interviews, interviewing with people, but some of the prompts that I use to manage that interview might affect the outcome in some way. So you kind of need to think about all of that as well. And that's what a methodology section is meant to do. It's meant to help you map out what the things you are bringing into the research are, and what some of the outcomes that could occur because of the choices that you make. And some references there, Heron and Reason from the first one, quite well known. Saunders is a bit of a guru, so we'll be coming back to good old Saunders. And I've also got a last little quote there, which is not from a standard kind of methodology text. I'm looking around because I had a few this morning, but I've obviously left them somewhere else. I was going to hold them up for you. Things like Cresswell, one of the most well-known methodology texts around research design. And I've got the last quote is from more of a kind of HDR support site. So just to show you, even outside the traditional texts around methodology, there's an understanding, a common understanding of what methodology is across all sources. And this site argues that it's the practical how of any given piece of research. So it's how you systematically design a study to ensure valid and reliable results that address the research aims and objectives. Now, when we talk about valid and reliable results, that language tends to have come from the sciences and empirical research, observed research, research that's kind of starting off with some rules or some things that are known and testing them against specific circumstances. So it tends to be a little bit sciencey sounding. We don't necessarily, in our research, if you're in humanities or in creative arts, you don't have to, your thesis won't pass or fail on the question of reliability and validity. Somebody is not necessarily going to be expected to come behind you and use exactly the same steps and get the same outcome as you, especially if you're interviewing with something like open-ended questions, where you are maybe shifting what comes out from the interviewer because of your very presence in that interview. But we do expect that there is by having a methodology section, that the examiner or anyone reading this thesis is going to be able to understand why you've taken the steps you have, and that these are the right steps in order to get an appropriate outcome, and that outcome would only have been secured by using those steps. So in humanities research, that question of reliability or being able to replicate results is a little bit not as concrete and certain as it is in science areas, but we do still need to be valid and reliable, in the sense that we need to have enough of a sample size as required by our methodology that we're using. So if we're using something like phenomenology, that tends to have a smaller sample size. Maybe you can use 5 to 15 people in phenomenology, and that is enough to give a valid result. And when we're talking about a valid result, what we're meaning is that there is enough data gathered to logically come to the conclusion that you have. If you don't have enough data, it's very hard to say that your results are valid or accurate or indicative or representative. So as you write up your methodology sections and your thesis, you do really need to think about those sort of words like valid and reliable, and what you mean by using them. And that's something I'll talk about in another session further along. And so the idea in that last dot point is around being systematic. So a lot of the time when we're doing research, it may not feel systematic, especially if it's creative research where we're using a practice-led model, which is more iterative. We're bouncing between looking at other creative works, looking at journal articles, looking at what other practitioners have done. But we still, when we write up our methodology section, we account for what may seem like a slightly chaotic process sometimes in terms of I'm using a methodology that invites that open-ended interaction. So you need to think about looking systematic in some way in your methodology section. And that doesn't mean you can't change what you're doing when you're out in the field or when you're researching in order to align to changes. You just need to be able to explain what you've done with that. So as I said before, any questions, jump in and ask or pop them up in the chat. All good. So I wanted to take you through where you can find some methodology sections, so some other theses. And I've covered this before in other sessions, but I think it's just amazing I'm always surprised how a lot of people don't really look at other theses until you're kind of probably past the midpoint, but you should start looking early, I always think. But I'll leave it up to you to decide when the right time is for you. So I've got a couple of ideas around where you can find particular thesis of interest to you. The first place to start I always recommend is Swinburne's Research Bank. And that's just a nice simple URL, researchbank.swinburne.edu.au. You can also go into the library site. If you go into the library, it's a little bit harder to find. You have to go to the special collections page, and that gives you entry into Swinburne thesis, but you can also go to Research Bank. It's kind of the same connection. And once you go to Research Bank, you just go down to the side here and you choose Browse by Publication Type. And when you're in Browse by Publication Type, which is the next little image here, you click on Thesis. And when you click on Thesis, that will then give you the third column here. That'll be a third page that opens up. And that then gives you the type of thesis that you can look at. So if you're doing a master's, you might want to look at only master's thesis, because it's that methodology section is going to be a bit shorter than a PhD thesis section, a method section in a PhD, or you might want to look at integrated PhD, or there is artifact and exegesis there as well. So you can choose according to what the thesis length is that you would like to access. There's also some great sites for accessing thesis outside of Swinburne, and these are a list that's been provided on the special collections page at the Swinburne Library website. And so we've got Trove, which is an Australian national database. It's not always able, you don't always have full access to those theses. Sometimes it says this is embargoed, or you could email the author. So that's something that may occur. But what you go into with any of these, and with the one on Swinburne Research Bank, go into those and just type the topic that you're looking for. And it's up to you how specific you want to be. It could be sustainability. It could be sustainability for urban living. It could be sustainability in retirement homes. So start kind of general, see what's there, and then just keep kind of narrowing your search down. So there's a range of those there that you can use. And some of them will have theses that are not in English, and some will have a mix. So I always enjoy cruising through those. So that's a way to find the thesis in your area, and then maybe using the methodology that you might be interested in using. So you could also type in a methodology name if you want to. So you could type in critical discourse analysis, media retirement homes, if you're wanting to see what's been done about the published work in the media about retirement homes through a critical discourse analysis methodology. So great opportunities there. So I'll send those around, but you can actually just get them from the Swinburne Library website. Okay, so now thinking about what a methodology chapter looks like. And there's a few different examples here. So I've tried to capture the various types. So looking at ones that are participant focused, looking at ones that are historical, so that they don't have participants. They're looking more at a set of texts. Also, I've got some examples from artifact and exegesis here as well. So this is really looking, the purpose of these is to really, for you to have a look at what the kind of subsections are in a methodology section, and for me to be able to talk you through some of the variances in these. So the first one we have here is from a master's thesis, and that's looking at, it was interviewing people trying to get their life experience around asthma adherence to asthma medications. And so this was doing participant research, and it was interviewing people, and also did, interestingly, also got the participants to submit an image that for them represented how they felt when they were dealing with their asthma or having an asthma attack, but probably more dealing with their asthma. So if you look at the type of contents page we have here, so this is just a methodology section. I've got the page numbers there so you can see how much time or how many words that were spent on each of these particular subsections. So in the first section 3.1, there's a very short introduction, which would usually tell us what the aims of the project are and what the research question is. Now, we know that you've already covered that in the introduction of the thesis itself, and in the, probably in virtually every other section of the thesis, but we usually always reiterate it at the start of the methodology section, just because we're making the examiner or the reader think, okay, I'm looking at the way the research was done. You do not want that for some reason the researcher, the examiner, to be reading through your steps and not remembering exactly what your aims were or what you were trying to achieve. So it's just common practice that we would have a reiteration of the research question and of the aims of the research if you have aims, or hypothesis if you're working with hypothesis. And one of the tricks around this is to be very careful when you do restate the research question, that it is actually consistent throughout the thesis. Sounds so obvious, right? But you'd be surprised how frequently people would make a small change to the language of the research question because they don't want to repeat the same thing over and over again. And we always say, don't use the same terms and expressions, vary it a little bit for interest in reading, but you have to be careful that you don't accidentally make the research question less clear, or that you don't introduce an element that actually makes it look like the research question is about something else. The amount of times I've sat in progress reviews and we've kind of read through the work and the comment comes up as, well, you've actually got it seems to be 3 different sort of research questions that you've got moving through this thesis. You need to either use the same one throughout or pull them together in your language so they're very, very similar. So, and that's something that you may end up doing as a last edit through on your thesis, to go through and kind of circle all of those things that need to be consistent throughout. So the focus of the question, so that would be just giving a little bit more information about the research question. If I was going to make a suggestion here, I would say you could conflate 3.1 and 3.2 together, and just have the introduction doing the work of focusing the question of the study. So just reminding the examiner what that's about. So you could conflate those. Then this thesis jumps quite quickly into just the nuts and bolts of what I did to carry out this research. My participants were these, and what I've highlighted there, 3.3 down to 3.4, all of 3.3 is just talking about participant selection. So 3.3 might start off with telling us the number of participants that were interviewed or engaged with, possibly their gender breakdown if that's important, or looking at areas that they might have got them from if that's important, age, demographic, anything that is, chances are that you would have written on your ethics application. And that is something that you'll find with any research or any methodology section that has had an ethics clearance, or any thesis or research that's had an ethics clearance. You can often just pretty much copy and paste a lot of what was in your ethics clearance into your methodology section, because you would have already worked through all of these things about demographic and why, and defended why you've chosen these people to be participants in that ethics clearance. So you don't have to reinvent the wheel. Go back to your ethics clearance and roll in what you can into here. And so this person's then looked at inclusion criteria. Who are the people that are included in this study? Exclusion criteria, who am I not going to include? Often these are things like how long someone has been affected by the particular thing you're investigating. So if it's something around asthma, it might be you need to have been diagnosed with asthma for at least 4 years, or you may need to be between 18 and 25 and have had asthma and be using an asthma reliever. If I was doing something, say interviewing in industry, I want to interview someone who's working in or a group of people that are working in a particular vocation, then I might say my inclusion criteria are the people that are working as teachers in a school, particular 3 schools in the western suburbs or in the eastern suburbs or across Melbourne, and they have to have worked for a certain number of time. They have to teach a certain number of classes a week. So you really zone in on what it is that you are, who it is that you're needing to interview, what type of experiences in the field are you looking for, how long do they need to have done this for, and maybe you know, have they, you know, are they a member of a particular association? You will know what it is you need to find from these people, but often it takes a little bit of thinking through. And so that's something you, as I said, you would have done with your ethics clearance. Thinking about exclusion criteria as well, definitely you always put that in, and how you might think, well, what is the difference between inclusion and exclusion other than them being opposite? Well, they're not always opposite. You could have that an exclusion criteria could be that it has to be people that are residing in the city of Melbourne. It could be also an exclusion criteria is often if you're interviewing something that's a little bit traumatic or that has touched on some sort of health issue. An exclusion criteria might be that the person has no reported illnesses or mental health challenges around this area. So you want to exclude people that you may accidentally re-traumatize in some way. So often an exclusion criteria can be a way of protecting participants, but you might say that they have declared that they have not. So in your initial recruitment, you would have worked that out. They would have had to have ticked whether they've got a particular ailment or a particular health condition or not. And in the recruitment section, you would be talking about what, how you've reached out to these people. Have you put ads out? Have you done snowballing, as in people have asked other people that they know or have told them you're doing the research and they're like, yeah, I'd like to participate in that. So they contact you. The old, do you know anyone else who would be interested in doing this research? So but you don't have to include a picture of the ad or the text of the ad. Some people do include the text, but you don't have to. And you don't have to, if you have done anything design-wise, you don't have to include any images of that. So it's more just about intellectually talking it through what the recruitment guidelines are that you're offering and why. And then thinking about, the person's gone on to talk about the data collection. So they've talked about, obviously this is a methodology section. It's not an analysis section. So they're not going to be talking about what they found. That is for another chapter. In the data collection, you're talking about how it is that you are going to analyze that. So you might be using thematic analysis. It might be that you're using coaxial coding, or what type of coding. Or alternately, you could put that in another section in the methodology, which the person has done here in 3.6. So it's up to you. You may not want a 3.6 information analysis section. You might put that up there under data collection. So there's just that flexibility as you go through and look at other methodology sections. So, well, I don't need to put that use that section in mind. You've got that freedom because each of them are very can be different. You just, as long as you covered the main points. So limitations to data collection. This can be things like I had to switch from doing face-to-face interviews to Zoom interviews. Therefore, people may be giving me their interview answers at home with other families or members around, so there may be a lack of privacy on their part. So the idea that you're just identifying any of the sort of potential challenges that may affect the type of data you get. It may be a limitation of data collection, maybe that you know a lot of the people that you're interviewing or that you're engaging with because you're in the same industry. It could also be that you're, in terms of other limitations, it could also be that that's because of lockdowns, you were going to work, you needed to interview them in the workplace, to observe them in the workplace, and you couldn't, so you then had to change what you did. So it's just kind of letting the examiner know what some of the challenges were in that research, and that's quite a smart thing to do because it means that you're plugging some of the holes that the examiner might see. The examiner might say, well, why is this here? Why didn't you do this? Why, you've only interviewed women. Why haven't you interviewed a broader range of genders or sexual identities? And you being able to address that in there helps the examiner say, oh, okay, yeah, that makes sense. So it means you're less likely to have that flip back to you after the examination process as an amendment to be made by the examiner. Theoretical framework 3.5. This one is really interesting because you will, most of the time, you will have already had a separate theoretical framework chapter that may have been, that's often after the methodology, sometimes it's before, but even if you've got a separate chapter, it's quite common to still talk about any framework in a more succinct and summarized way in the methodology as well. So some people do, if your theoretical framework is quite small, if there's not a lot you're really going to say about that for some reason, then you may want to put it in the methodology rather than having that as a separate chapter. And as you can see here, this person's only given it a page because her theoretical framework, which was, I think she used phenomenology and also another approach, that was given a whole separate chapter. So, but she just gave it a nod here so that the person that was reading it could see how this theoretical framework would relate to the methodology. Because if you've got it in a separate section, the framework is, you're just talking about, well, what this framework is, how it's useful for this type of topic. But with the theoretical framework in the methodology, you're actually looking at how you're using it in the methodology, like how it relates to the whole project, how it's going to be used as a step. So thinking then about information analysis. So that next step may be where you tell us how you're going to analyze that data. So are you going to be using thematic analysis? Are you going to be using textual analysis if you're looking at films or other books or text, or are you doing some type of coding? What type of coding? So you then just give us a rundown of that in that section. And then moving on to the ethical considerations, if there are any that are pertinent to the topic or to the project, you'd put them in there. So talking about the type, how you gained informed consent, what is, how did you approach that? How are you going to ensure the confidentiality of participants? Somebody, I might just mute everyone. Somebody's got a little bit of noise coming from there. So forgive me, everyone, for muting you all. Okay, hopefully you can still hear me. If not, flip it in the text, which is funny because you won't be able to hear me. Okay, so thinking then also about anonymity, how are you going to maintain anonymity for them if that's needed? How are you going to store that information? Exactly what's in your ethics clearance, and thinking about the level of risk, which is to participants, if any, which is also in your ethics clearance. So remembering that your examiner does not get a copy of your whole ethics clearance. They usually just, or your ethics application, they might just get the approval letter at the end. So this is where you actually can reassure them that you have conducted your research in an appropriately ethical manner, and that the university supports you in your ethicality, if that's a word. So making sure that you include that there means that the examiner has a greater sense of trust in your research, hopefully. The rigor of the study, just talking about aspects such as, this was a kind of health-based thesis. So we talked about credibility, transferability, dependability, confirmability, all of this, in other words, validity. How do we demonstrate that this is valid? You may not have a 3.8 in your thesis. And then we just gave a little chapter summary at the end. So that's one example. So another one that we're looking at now is a little bit more around using kind of mixed methods. So we use observation, we used survey, a questionnaire, and also used collection of journals. We got the participants to write in a journal. So there were a few different sorts of methods that we used in this particular thesis. So in this methodology section, we talked about research design, which is something we didn't really talk about in the previous example that I've given you. And there's a lot of discussion around, well, what is the difference between research design and methodology? And sometimes people will actually call their methodology chapter research design, and your supervisor will kind of have a recommendation for you around that. If you're doing artifact and exegesis, you might just want to call it research method. We might just say methodology. And there are I've got some suggestions for artifact and exegesis further along too. So research design in this example is talking about the particular choices the person's made around the research methods. So it's kind of how we put it all together. So in the introduction to that, which would have been just 3, she's talked about, well, this is the methodology I'm going to use, and the research design just actually broke it down into a clearer set of steps. So she's talked about the research context. So why am I doing this research? Why is this research important? But you don't want to reiterate too much of what you got in the other chapters. This is very much about, well, the context is, this is taking place in Indonesia. This is in first year university, and I'm running this through about 3 different classrooms with 3 different teachers. So the context of where the research was held was really important. Things like, this is the largest university in Indonesia, and it focuses heavily on literature and writing. It's not so much a science-focused university. So we needed to kind of know that in order to understand what how the outcomes occurred. So, you know, if I was doing this research in another sort of university, we might have a different sort of set of outcomes, because we were looking at writing students and how students use their identity to create stories when they're in a city, a multicultural city, and they themselves may have come from a different culture or a different ethnic group. So context was really important around this particular research project. So if you're kind of feeling that if somebody just read your findings, they wouldn't really get a true sense of the complexities that you've drawn the participants from, the complexities of the stories they've told, and how that's particular to the places that you interviewed them in or where they've come from. It's absolutely fine to have a research context, particularly, you know, if you're looking at how they might have dealt with or experienced policy, or experienced how they might have navigated Centrelink. If you're writing about that, then the context needs to be telling us a little bit about that, what Centrelink is and what that experience is. So that's quite a powerful subheading that you can use, just in case you feel that people are not getting understand or get completely why the outcomes are so interesting and so specific. And also thinking about the participants, the standard one here, who they are, where you got them from, all of that. The role of the researcher. If this person was also a teacher of these students previously, so her role as a researcher needed to be unpacked a little bit so that we understood her own subjectivities and how she was going to manage working with people that she already knew, or she may have been in a power relationship with as a teacher with students. So it's talking about how she positions herself in the research, and how, you know, how she mitigated those kind of challenges. And then she went in to talk about the kind of more nitty-gritty stuff of like, okay, these are the steps I'm going to take, these are the methods of data collection I'm going to do, thematic analysis, etc., and any research ethics considerations. So she's broken those down into 2 sections, phase 1 and phase 2. And in that phase 1 and phase 2, she has talked about the various methods that she's going to use, methods of collection. So she's talked about why she did an initial survey of the students, why then she got them to create a journal, why then she got them to do open-ended interviews, and then why she asked to see their creative writing at the end. So she could have put more subheadings in 3.3.1 and 3.3.2 of methods: survey, questionnaire, journal, samples of work, interview. But she has just kind of, in her content, she's just kind of put them down as under phase 1 and phase 2, and she might have subheadings within that text there rather than putting it in the contents page. She's then gone on to talk about how she's analysed the data, which is the same as we saw in the other example from the ASMA one that I used. So talking about how the data was analysed. Don't give the outcome of the analysis in this section. We just talk about the process. So we used this particular type of coding in vivo. I used textual analysis to look at the students' work. I identified 3 or 4 themes. You know, don't necessarily outline what they are. I mean, you can just give some small hints as to what they were if you want here, but remember, this is a recipe. Methodology section is step by step. We don't have to reveal the answers to things in this section. And then talks about how she interpreted it, like if she used a particular method of interpretation, maybe she used IPA, interpretive phenomenological analysis, that maybe was her method of interpretation. And then she talks about how she went about the observations of the data in the classroom, how she moved from being in a classroom originally to observing a Zoom class, or a different, I think they use WhatsApp actually in that classroom, and breaking down then how she analysed each of those. She talks about trustworthiness, which comes up a lot in research design, which is, well, how do you know as a reader that you can trust my data? So the answer to that might be that she's triangulated across the journals, looking at something that's come out of the journals, seeing if that also came out of the interviews, if it was also evident as a theme in the writing that the students did. So this idea of triangulation is in, you're looking at, and it can be, doesn't have to be 3 points, it could be 4 points. You're looking at 4 data point or 4 means of data collection as a way of checking that there's a similarity in the results. You may not do that, you may only have 1, but then you might want to talk about, well, what steps did you take to double check that your data was accurate, or that you've come up with a consistent approach. And then she gives a little chapter summary. In this chapter, in the next chapter, I will. So that's another common example. So I just want to toss in, I think this is from a website that has, breaks down thesis chapters and gives really specific examples of what each can hold. I think it's called, what's it called? I can't remember. I'll find out and I'll email it around as part of the slides. So this is an example of how you can actually write it up. So using some of the language here. So just there we go. So looking here at sample opening. So I'm looking at the 3rd paragraph. The authors open this as, this chapter describes the design adopted by this research to achieve the aims and objectives stated in section 1.3 of chapter 1. Now, if you're doing artifact and exegesis, you may not be using that sort of language. You might be using a kind of more creative, explorative language. But some artifacts and some exegesis do use this style. It's up to you. And then this discusses the methodology to be used in the study, the stages, etc. So this slide gives a nice little breakdown of the type of language you can use to introduce it. But what they've done here is they've conflated methodology and research design together. So breaking them down in each and actually talking about what each of them do that's different. So in this particular model, we have 3.1.1 methodology, which is going to be you talking about your kind of framework that you're coming to. So there might be some talk about epistemology, ontology, which I'll come to in a minute, or if it's going to be an experimental, or if it's correlational, or if you're going to be doing case studies. So it's kind of mapping out what your methods are going to be, but also giving you a kind of broader framework. So you could say, I am using a critical discourse methodology, and the methods that I will be using are this and that. So that's kind of a little introduction. And the research design goes into more specific, in this example, detail about the methods. So you can see they're kind of looking at the research design category as a way of talking about variables and the particular methods that might be used. So that's an interesting way. Instruments, if you're using if you're doing quantitative research and you're using surveys, or if you're doing what kind of tools you're using. So instruments and tools are kind of similar, but instruments, we often use that term to mean specific type of survey in psychology. There may be 4 or 5 different survey instruments that you use. So then this one has procedure and timeline, and then how you're going to analyze the data. So I'm not a great fan, I think, of this one. I think this is not as clear as the other ones to follow. The other ones have more specific sections. But another example for you, if you're kind of moving into a bit of a mixed method approach where you're using qualitative and quantitative measures there. And also the last section it has there is ethics and limitations. So that's always good to see that appearing as well in there. And you can also think about how you might position your methodology section if you're doing historical research as well. So I've got 2 examples from that. So historical research may be research that doesn't interview participants, that mainly looks at textual sources. So you're looking at the history of something. So you might be going into the library or an archive and looking at stories of people through diaries. You might be looking at a history of policy decisions. You may be looking at a set of films in an archive. You may be looking at the social and policy history or evolution of how a law came to be about. So these tend to use a bit of a different sort of methodology. And interestingly, what I have found when I look at these historical theses that use an historical methodology or that are based on evaluating or creating a history of something, they'll often not have a very strong methodology section. It may be actually included somewhere else. So I'll come to the second one in a minute, but if we look at the first one, so this one has talks a little bit about the case study they're going to be using, and this one was the history of PBS radio. So this person went out and did an official history of the programming, kind of analysed the programming over maybe 10, 15, or probably 30, 40 years, I think, from the 70s onwards, from when this radio station first started under an earlier name. So she's using this radio station, this one particular place, as a case study. So she only has one site of analysis. She's looking at one particular case study. So often when you're doing a thesis, you'll have maybe 3 case studies, 3 different examples of phenomena that relate to your question or that are linked to your the thing you want to evaluate. But in this instance, she's only used one. So she's then also saying, well, I've been sponsored and hired to do this research. So I'm a kind of insider. So I'm not necessarily as objective as an outside person might be. So she has declared her positionality under a section called insider research. And also she might have worked there at some point as well, or been a volunteer there over the years. So if you are a member of the community in which you are inquiring into, or you're studying, or you're doing research into, you probably want to have a section in your methodology on your positionality, either calling it axiology or positionality, or my position in the research. You can be quite open about it. You don't have to use the ology words, or something like insider, outsider experience. That's a common one from anthropology. She then explains the archives she's used. So she's made it very clear which archives she's used and why. She's using programming grids, which are the kind of charts that have all the different radio programs on there across a day. She's also looking at what's been the data entry that's occurred and how people classify music. So there are archives around that she's specifically looking at. So she's then going to be in that section explaining why she chose those above others, why she, which particular eras she might have privileged, if she privileged any, you know, perhaps where those archives are kept, if there's any challenges around the conditions of those, and maybe how these are maintained. She might investigate that in order to be able to identify anything that she hasn't been able to carry out in her research. You may find in my research there is a gap between 1972 and 1978. That is because there was a fire and the archives were burned. So she's kind of building that potential limitation into her discussion on the archives. She also did interviews. So she's then going into the more traditional sections there, talking about who she recruited and why, and how she went about those interviews. So her methodology section in the contents page is quite simple, but it's great to see she's actually then used basically three methods. She's used case study, she's used archival research, and she's used oral history. So she has gone into detail about each of those three as part of her overall methodology. So the fifth sample, looking at this one, is a history of the trade union movement. And in this one, interestingly, the methodology is quite small, and the methodology is in the introduction. That is not uncommon. And for artifact and exegesis, sometimes we put the methodology in the introduction. Sometimes for a smaller thesis, like an integrated PhD thesis, where the thesis is 20,000 words, or if it's artifact and exegesis 10,000, then we don't really have enough space and word count to have a separate chapter, so we might put that in the introduction. So you'll find that does occur. It's especially if the methodology is not particularly problematic, or it doesn't need a lot of unpacking, or if it's a methodology that actually doesn't have a lot written about it, or for something like practice-led research, where there's a lot written, but we're kind of saying similar things. There's not necessarily a lot of innovation in the field because the steps are quite consistent. So you may not need a whole separate chapter for that. You might put that in the intro. And then this person just jumped straight in and talked about the various eras of the history that they're creating. So that's an interesting one there. And thinking about artifact and exegesis, here's one here, which this one, The Warp, the Weft and the Loom, which is about it was a novel and a 20 to 30,000 word exegesis. An exegesis is a critical analysis of the kind of key themes and decisions that were made around the creation of an artifact, contextualizes the artifact in terms of creative process and kind of wider social and ethical issues that may have arisen as part of the themes of that artifact. So she's pulled her methodology down, pushed that down to chapter 4, and she's quite direct. She's talking about autobiography as a methodology and how this has been moved to autoethnography. So how she's looking at someone else's life and then she became a part of that person's life. So she's kind of just evolved steps in her methodology there. And this is as you can tell from the type of subhead titles of the chapters, gathering the threads, weaving the threads, building the loom, experienced weaver. This is a bit more of a creative approach, and it's not as scientifically worded because it's about a thesis about creative process, so it's allowed to be that. And next one there is also artifact and exegesis. And this is a little bit more of a traditional structure of methodology there. And her exegesis puts the methodologies section 2, and she's talking about exegetical methodology, how the creative works leads to the data for scholarship, particular approach she took, snowflake method, which is a creative process, and practice-led research, which is a methodology that she's used. She could have also just started that section as one dot practice-led research, but she's kind of as it's a creative thesis, she's kind of worked into her methodology more creatively, and she's talking about how she's used a range of different creative techniques. So there's a lot more fluidity in how you represent your methodology in artifact and exegesis, and very happy to run another session specifically on that. And so with artifact and exegesis, sometimes we do have participants in that. We often encourage people not to, because the exegesis and the creative work, the whole thesis, it's because it has the two components of artifact and exegesis, it's a really kind of switching modes halfway through. It's, in a sense, it's not a lot more work, but it's a lot of work to do that and have managed the participant process as well. So we often encourage people to not use participants in artifact and exegesis, but not a golden rule. Definitely you can, and then if you did, then you would be talking about the participants. For instance, one of my students is doing has done a game, and she designed the game, but as part of that design process, she interviewed and tested the game on primary school students. So she took a version of the game in and watched them play and observe them. So she needs to talk about that as talk about the participants and that process of observation in a step-by-step way in her exegesis, as she might in a traditional thesis. So different approach, but can still cover the same thing. So just coming back to the idea that you really need to make sure that whatever methodology you take upon, or you do, is actually the one that is needed to answer your research question. So you really need to remind the examiner and the person reading that chapter up front that this is the research question, because all of this coming after this is designed to answer that question. So the research question does need to be quite primary in your thinking about what methodology to use. And in order to help you construct a methodology section, you'll also find that there's something called the research onion. And you'll also notice when you read other methodologies, sometimes they open up with the research question, of course, but then they talk about epistemology and ontology. Not all theses do that, but if they do, it's usually in the methodology section. And so there's a lot of varying definitions of what epistemology and ontology are. And just to give you a quick, one quick interpretation of that, epistemology is what you know about the field, or what is acceptable knowledge in the field, in a discipline, and how you go about it. And ontology can be the system of belief that you've come in with that reflects an interpretation about what constitutes a fact. So epistemology is often seen as the acceptable knowledge in your area, what is known in your area, and ontology is the system of belief that you bring to that. But there are so many variances in the way to say that. So do have a look at that yourself, because it will kind of be different according to what your field is. But I just wanted to cover that quickly because I wanted to put it in the context of the research onion. Now, the research onion, I'm wrapping up in a minute, is super useful in terms of how to structure a methodology. Because if you look at this, you'll find that, just move that, you usually start from now I don't know if this is your left or right, it's my right, on the right side where it's epistemology or ontology. A thesis will often, a methodology section will have your statement of the research question and aims, and then it might talk about your epistemology and ontology, and then it may move to talking about the different the different philosophies. So they're the kind of epistemology and ontology are kind of the worldviews. Then you might start talking about the research philosophy. Is this a positivist approach? In other words, is this a kind of more sciencey approach? Is this looking at facts and the known world? I'm finding, I know that gravity exists. I'm going to test how it works when I'm underwater. Critical realism, when you're thinking about representing, you're starting with a kind of realist fact and you're going to evaluate that in your research. Interpretivism, when you want to see how people interpret the world around them. So you kind of then make a decision about which of those your research most aligns with. If you are going to use this kind of broader research onion approach in your methodology. If you look at the ones in your field, that will tell you whether or not that's a common thing to use. And then postmodernism, where there's questioning around truth. There is no one specific idea of what's real or what's true. And pragmatism, different aspect. And then you might, after you've talked about that for a couple of a couple of paragraphs, then you might talk about the type of research you're doing. Are you doing inductive research, deductive, or abductive? So are you working from one specific fact? You're working from a specific experience, and then, or a fact. Centrelink makes payments, to looking at the experience people have of engaging with Centrelink. So you're kind of starting with a fact and you're looking at the various interpretations of that, or how people experience that. Are you doing deductive? Are you starting with a particular aspect, and then looking at another? So you're starting with a fact and looking at if there are variances to that. It's a more scientific approach, basically. Or if you're doing adductive, where you're testing out a possible solution to something. Then a thesis methodology section will often look at quality. We'll talk about if it's qualitative, mixed methods, or quantitative. And then it might move to research strategy. So in other words, your methods that you're using. And then it might talk about where are you getting your, or how long are you doing this for? Are you doing this as a one-off interview process, or are you doing it over time? And then you'll talk about your data collection. So this research onion is actually the same, basically the same things that were covered in all the other thesis methodology contents pages, but it's just put it in a kind of different way. And you'll see this everywhere. And this was created by Saunders and his colleagues, kind of talking about business research, but it's quite standard across all different sorts of research. So that can actually help you work out how to structure your methodology section in the same way that the particular contents pages might have there. And my computer's decided to freeze. That's not so helpful. Maybe I'll just, as my computer is thinking, oh, there we go. I might open it up to questions now. I've just got some additional suggestions there for how to do things, but perhaps we'll leave it here and open it up to questions. Anyone have any questions about any ideas or any of the approaches people have taken to methodology?